Hello, everyone. Welcome to the concluding webinar in our Fall 2016 UNX series on unbiasing toward inclusivity and leadership. Before we jump into today's presentation, I have a few housekeeping reminders. Feel free to submit questions throughout the discussion in the Q&A box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. We'll reserve about 10 minutes at the end of today's presentation to answer those questions, and we'll be reviewing them throughout the conversation. We'll also be sending out a recording and a copy of the slides from the webinar directly to your inbox later this week, so keep an eye out for those. We are delighted to have Julie Staggs, Associate Client Partner at Korn Ferry Group, here with us today. Julie is an experienced talent and leadership consultant with over 30 years of experience in higher education leadership development. I couldn't be more excited to have her join us today to share tips and insights on defining and implementing inclusive leadership strategies from her work with institutions around the world. With that, I'll pass things over to Julie and let her kick things off for today's presentation.
Thanks so much, and it is my pleasure to be in part of this series, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with you all about a topic that we see every day in the news. I know as I read the Chronicle of Higher Ed each morning, and I know you all probably get those same alerts, story after story comes to the forefront of the way that we handle the diversity on our campuses and what that looks like. In our time together today, we're going to talk about a component of that, which is unconscious bias, and how do we move past those things that we're not aware we're doing. Sounds almost impossible, doesn't it? That if we don't know we're doing it, how do we deal with that? But today we'll talk about how do you bring those things to light, and what are some ways that we can help address that on our campus to be much more inclusive. As we navigate through our time together today, here are the things that we're going to talk about. We'll start by looking at bias in general, and why does it happen? What is it that our brains are doing to cause these things to happen? We'll turn our attention to looking at diversity and what are the dimensions of that. We see some of the most obvious ones as we read those news articles that come to the forefront, but it is an incredibly broad, large number of dimensions that diversity includes. I want to make sure that we bring that to the surface today as we think about this topic together. We'll turn from some common understanding of all those dimensions to looking at what does it mean to be an inclusive leader? Why do we want to be an inclusive leader? What does that mean? What is the case for that? What is our rationale to even move in that direction? And then I'm going to give you two tools today that help with that move to being more inclusive individually, you as a leader, as well as creating that environment on your campus, along with some tips, not only for you, but also in that leader mode. How do you create that inclusive environment? With that, I want to start with looking at bias. When we think about bias, it's something that we hear that word all the time in today's actual environment. We've just gone through an election. We heard that word a lot, thinking about bias. And just as a reminder for our common discussion today in common language, we think of bias as that judgment that we make. Even if there's information or data to the opposite, the contrary of what our judgment is, we're making a judgment. That means we have a bias for a particular way or a particular component or variable. When we think about unconscious bias, it means that we're making that judgment without even knowing that we're doing that. And often we wonder, how does that happen? It happens because our experiences come along with us and bring to the forefront ways that we think about particular variables that we see. As we get into the dimensions, we'll talk about that. But most often it's those obvious pieces, be it gender, race, economic class, those things that we're commonly hearing, but we judge the similarities and the differences. Both of these can affect how we work on a daily basis. It's how we engage, how we may treat others, how we categorize them, and the way that we begin to think or discuss. And neither of these are appropriate in how we manage talent. If we begin with these definitions of bias and unconscious bias, what is it that makes us think this way? Why do we do this? Research by Dr. Anthony Greenwald out of the University of Washington is a good place for us to start to talk about what is happening basically in our brains. His research looked at how do people begin to think about things and how do they come to any situation. And from his research, he began to categorize in these two areas what we think of as first level thinking and second level thinking. We often believe that we are doing first level thinking, where we think that it's intentional, that it's thoughtful, we're looking at the facts, we're making a rational decision, we're being very deliberate about the way that we see a situation, and we often consider this the higher level of thinking. Now, if I ask any of you at any particular moment around talent or diversity on your campuses, you would tell me that you're doing first level thinking here. And you with all this intention would think that you are. However, what most often happens in many situations, and of course here with diversity and inclusion, is that we are really operating at that second level. That's where we're doing things just by rote, or just automatically things happen, or from an impulse. Something triggers and we react. We often see that as the lower level thinking. As we think about this framework of these two kinds of thinking, I want to give you a bit more color around each one. If we start with the second level thinking, here are some examples of that. It's where we do things that are familiar with us, or those motor tasks that we do all the time and we don't think about. We tie our shoes, or we jump on a bicycle and take off riding to get some exercise. We don't really think about the mechanics of how we're riding the bicycle. Another great example of this is today when you got in your car to drive to work. You probably got in the car, you turned it on, you pulled into the road, and you know that there's probably a couple of traffic lights, there may be a left turn, a right turn, or getting on and off of a highway, pulling into the parking lot where you park on campus. All those things you do, you probably were thinking about what your calendar said for the day as you were driving along, and you didn't consciously think about where those turns were. If I quizzed you when you got to your office, you would tell me that on the way to work, you were thinking through your day's agenda and not consciously watching for your next turn or using your GPS to do that. Doing this familiar task is part of that second level. It also is when a good way to think about it is if we've practiced, we've been on a team, we may play tennis or basketball or golf, and the skill is second nature to us. When we're in the zone, when we're not thinking, when we're just moving with the sport, with the game, with the flow of what we're doing in our athletics, that's also second level thinking. It also is a place in our social interactions where we just naturally have a conversation. This actually happened to me this morning on a plane. I sat down without even consciously thinking. I turned to the person beside me. We began to chat, and we literally talked the whole way to my destination. Because it was informal, I listened, we responded, didn't really think about engaging in a conversation. Our brain does this because we have so many functions that go on around us that some of these become less conscious, but it helps us operate in a more efficient and effective manner. If that's our second level thinking, let's turn our attention for a moment to first level thinking and what that looks like. While we understand what underlies that, a good way to think about the first level is, again, in those motor tasks that have become familiar, we don't even think about them, they just happen. At some point, before we just jumped on to get exercise with our bike, we had to learn to ride it. We had those training wheels. There was somebody behind us holding on and telling us how to balance and what it should feel like. That's the first level thinking, very intentional, thinking specifically about what we're doing, being thoughtful. We also do that in non-routine social interactions, where it's a much more formal conversation, perhaps in another culture, when we're trying to remember the right etiquette or the format. That's where we have to be much more intentional. We must look at what's presented in front of us and be more rational. And that's where we need to be focused as we think about diversity and inclusion. It takes a lot of work for us to move from that second level, which happens without us even intending it, to that first level. If it takes work to do that, why is it so difficult for us to move from the second to the first? Let me remind you a little bit about what's going on in our brains. They're a pretty amazing machine that we've been gifted with. And we think about what is going on. We have over 11 million different inputs that come our way per second. If you stop and think about that, that's a bit overwhelming. And now we wonder why we're so rushed. We have so much information overload. This is why. We can take in that much information, but we're only consciously aware of about 40 of those inputs. That's a huge difference in ratio. To be able to handle all that input, our unconscious mind begins to manage that input by putting some things on autopilot. Some of these you're probably well aware of from your different expertise in the sciences, or what all of us learned as we were coming along in school, that if we look at the brain itself, the amygdala is where we breathe and we blink and we do those things that we don't have to think about that. And that's a way that we can operate and be efficient. The unconscious mind does put a lot of what we need to do to survive in autopilot. Those shortcuts that our brain creates lets us interpret those inputs much more quickly. So instead of seeing in the past and in the early days of human development, in the dinosaurs roaming on the earth, if you saw a big animal with big teeth, you didn't have to think, what do I do about that? Your brain already knew that you needed to run. It saves time and energy, and quite honestly, in that case, it actually helped us survive. Our brain creates these shortcuts based on our past experiences, and it helps us deal in some automatic ways, as well as then we can override that with intention. But the automatic is what comes into play first, hence the second level thinking. If this is what's happening in our brain that's causing these unconsciously biased thoughts to happen, then what is it that makes the brain go into that mode? It typically is when these kinds of things that you see here happen. When we're angry or stressed or pressed for time or trying to multitask, the autopilot kicks in our mind, and our past experience is brought to the front, and we process much more quickly. You'll probably notice here that there are really two key things that cause us to activate these biases. If you categorize these things you see listed here, they really fall into two buckets. One would be emotion, the other would be capacity. So when is it that we are frustrated or angry or stressed? Or the capacity, we're running short on time, or we have too many activities pressing in on us. That's often when we kick into that second level thinking and where things occur that we don't intend. If that's what our brains are doing to help us, but not always being the most helpful, and these are the triggers that cause that, so where do we see these things happen in our daily lives? One of my favorite things is to say, if we understand the construct, the model, the information, what does that look like for us individually? I want to ask you to think about, where does this show up on your campus? If there are times with those triggers that unbiased conscious can come to the forefront, let's think about what those look like. I've had the opportunity to work with a number of campuses around this topic. And as we often do an activity that uses these 4 areas, and it varies from institution to institution, I ask them to think about, how can bias show up on my campus? What does that look like? And I want to share with you what has come to the forefront in those conversations in these particular areas. Just some examples for you to think about as you focus on your campus and take a step back and say, where can it show up? If we look at the first area of the talent cycle, it could show up in the way a job listing is written. It could be asking for certain types of experience. It could be asking for experience where there are limited institutions that would have provided that kind of degree, or numbers of years of experience. It could be in the way that you recruit, simply where you post the job listings. It could be where you have relationships with different graduate programs that you're drawing postdocs from. It could also be in how people are selected for roles, the way that your selection committees are put together, or in the way that promotions occur. It could be that it's unintentional, but the stipulations cause a challenge. In the second area, student life, several that have come up as schools have thought about this in workshops with me, things like the Greek system. It could be that students are very particular about, the kind of high school that you came from, or your experience, or your socioeconomic level. They may not even be realizing that that's what they're doing. They have a comfort level with students like themselves. So often they'll be accepting and rushing students that are more like themselves. It could be in the kinds of clubs that are available on campus. It could be in the way that the facilities are available for students to interact and engage. A particular example of that, a campus that was a state university that was trying to broaden out its reach to different populations, was trying to get them to come to campus, and they were located geographically in a place that was a bit remote. They were trying to recruit more Hispanic students, and once they got on campus, they were not providing places where the students could be close enough to interact with their own families, which was really important. Students were sharing that they felt very alienated, that they felt like they didn't have a group to belong to. So making sure that there's a consideration about the different profiles of students, what is comfortable for them. While there were many activities available to the students, when they were asked, just because the folks planned the kinds of things that they had been used to doing in their own college experience, they were not the things that served the needs of the students at that particular campus. In the third area, academic planning and courses, thinking about where can bias show up, it can be in the kinds of programs that are offered. What are the prerequisites? Does someone need to have had certain courses coming into the institution? Simple example here that came from a technical institution. Again, this one was also a state institution. They have students take in their first year courses in the degree. Well, that's an excellent thing to do, and it's a differentiator for them to have students jump into their major. One of the things they realized as we were having this discussion is that many students who had the skill, the ability, the grades, the intelligence to be in an engineering program had not been exposed to a broad range of majors, therefore were not able to declare a major as they came in. As they began to think about that and began to ask applicants why they had dropped out of the process of applying to the institution, they realized there was an unintended bias against students who had not had the opportunity to more fully explore what the different degrees provided to them, or what you even called a degree if they wanted to design cars or to build skyscrapers, whatever that may be. As unusual as that may sound to some of us, that someone may not understand what degree would lead them to those skills, absolutely for some students, they hadn't had the opportunity to understand what that looked like. In the fourth area, thinking about enrollment services and alumni, some of the things that have come to light in the different sessions are thinking about the admissions criteria. What is it that students need to present as their experience? Thinking about where is it that schools are recruiting, what types of high schools. A big issue that's come up several times is the homeschool market. Students that may not be in an institution, how do you reach them? How do you help them become a part of the enrollment process? The other end of that life cycle of a student or of someone who engages with your institution would be the alumni. Thinking about how do you provide for events? Is it for all ages? Is it for folks in many different industries? Is it for professionals as well as people that may be homemakers? How do you provide for a broad range? Where does that bias show up as you're working across the alumni world? One of the pieces that came up in a discussion that was rather interesting was thinking about who do you ask for donations? Well, it would seem logical that you go to the folks that have the professions or the jobs that provide them an income that would allow them to give. What came up in one of my discussions with an institution, which was a private institution, was the fact that alumni should be valued for the differences they bring to the table and what it they can give of their time, of their energy, resources other than money, and valuing all those equally, not just the large donation. I hope that those give you some things to think about as you look at your campus and begin to identify where can bias show up that's unintentional. As we think about these different ways in which it can show up, we want to think about what is diversity? You know, we talk about diversity and inclusion, but I'd like to think about a definition, a working definition that is beyond just the typical. Often we focus on, and in the early days of even talking about this topic, it was about gender, race, and often age. But there's so many types of differences that we as individuals hold. And thinking about what do we value, what do we see, what do we have comfort with well beyond that. I want to share a working set of definitions with you around three key terms as we talk about this topic. These are the ways that we at Korn Ferry Hay Group talk about diversity, inclusion, and engagement. We think about diversity as a fact. It is, you know, looking at how do you name the differences and similarities. It's what you can see and what you can't see, but it's all those components that make each of us a unique individual. All the ways in which you can describe us, how we think, how we feel, how we look, how we engage and interact. Inclusion is how we behave. It is a behavior. Is it that we just recognize and see those differences, or do we value them at a next level? And can we fully leverage all these differences and make those differences make a difference? The third term I'd like to suggest you think about in this realm of diversity and inclusion is engagement. And engagement is an emotion. It's how you are connected to the people in the workplace or the people with whom you interact and work in different settings. And it is how your discretionary energy is expended. When we think about engagement, that emotion of, do I love my job and I'm willing to do more, or am I not happy at all and I do the very minimum that I have to do? As we think about these three terms, I want to take a deeper dive into the first one of diversity. I've mentioned several times that there are multiple ways in which diversity can be defined, and there are multiple components and variables. I want to show you the model that we use to think about these dimensions. Far beyond some of the typical ones we think of that here in the physical category are maybe the first ones that come to mind, where we think about race, gender, age, sexual orientation, some of those things, appearance, mental abilities. As this topic became top of mind a number of years ago, those were the places that we first began to address. If you take a look at the model that we use here, the We Connect, how do we connect model, you'll notice if I go to the left, the cognitive. In higher ed, this is a huge piece. We learn so much, and we want to bring in different perspectives and different areas of expertise, hence why we have different colleges and departments on our campuses. We also think in the cognitive of personality style. How do we gain our energy, the introvert or the extrovert? What is our actual cognitive level with IQ, or what is our EQ, our ability to handle and work with emotions? Our communication, what does that look like? If we continue around to the left, you see relational. How do we interact with others? Are we married? Are we single? Are we divorced? Are we separated? What is our personal behavior? How do we interact? Do we like groups? Do we do more one-on-one? How do we do with relationships? What are our skills in that area? Continuing to our left, we see occupational. What is it that we do in our expertise? How long have we done that? What is our affiliation with others that have that kind of expertise? Or how do we interact with other expertise based on our own? What are our industries? And then what is it we bring to the table in our status? This is a key piece, of course, within your faculty and administration. If we continue on to look at societal, what has been our background? What were we born into, and what have we moved into? What is it we bring to the table from how we may have traveled around the world or throughout the US? Or if we've come into a different situation and we've tried a new culture. We encourage this in our students to learn from that, but also to understand their own culture, to bring that to the table. As we continue around to the last area we haven't explored together, that would be around values. Thinking about how do we believe either politically or in a spiritual or a faith sense or in cultures. That would be our final area as we think about all these components that make up who we are as individuals. When we think about not only how does this look on our campus, but as you all engage with Converge, it is about marketing, and you think, so how do I look at the profile of my different audiences? What is it that they're going to have as a lens? What is going to be their perspective? And it's never one single piece from this wheel. As you think about marketing and you present information in a way that people are going to accept it or it's going to engage them, I encourage you to look at all these areas, and as you write profiles for who you're trying to reach with information, is to think in a broader fashion about who they are. Now that we've taken a look at these different dimensions, let me suggest a way that you can think about those two terms in relationship to one another, diversity and inclusion. We like to think about diversity as being the mix of all those pieces we just saw in the model, whereas inclusion is the way that you make that mix work. Why do we care about making that mix work? Why is that even important? As we think about our campuses, we have a mission that is why our institutions exist. And if we think about the foundational piece of inclusion, that it is finding a way to live out our mission, it is also foundational to just continuing to exist in the volatile, changing world that exists today. You noticed here that I use the word business case, and I know that while as institutions we think more about focusing on mission, we still have to function and operate in a sense, in a business mode, so that we're able to provide the services that students need, a place where academics can interact, and where we can prepare people to be contributing parts of society. In today's world, we know that it is incredibly important for institutions to not only exist at kind of a status quo, but to continue to grow. It is a challenge to do that, and inclusion is a key to growth. It helps you to grow in differentiated ways. Having a variety of viewpoints helps you create and innovate. As you think about marketing, it also helps you have new ways in which you reach people. That innovation and having these different perspectives is also how you bring in diverse new people to not only increase the output of what's going on in the institution, but to make it a much richer experience. That's why making sure that there's an inclusive environment and that it's not only just accepting, but it's seeking out that diversity and those differences that make a difference, makes a difference in the way that institutions exist and continue to provide what they provide to society. As we think about this being the reason we want to be inclusive, is to live out our mission, to continue to grow. The reality is that as we try to create that on our campuses, we all react and behave in very different ways to people that are unlike ourselves. That's a reality. So as we talk about bias, unconscious bias, how do we move into being more inclusive, bringing that to the surface so it doesn't hinder our ability to value the differences that exist on our campuses? I want to give you two tools to think about as we're saying, what does this look like? How do we live this out on our campuses? How do we live this out in our marketing and bringing people to be a part of who we are? The first tool I want to suggest to you is one that we use called the tolerance scale. When we think about the way we're behaving and reacting to others, again, having a language to talk about this is really critical. I'm going to begin in the middle of the scale to tell you how we use this to talk about the reactions and the interactions between people in any environment or campus climate. In the middle, you see tolerance. Often, tolerance is where you feel good that you've gotten there, that with so many different types of people and perspectives on your campus, that you can get people to be at this level on this spectrum. When we use tolerance as the indicator, what that means is that while people don't completely feel comfortable with other people's differences, they believe that other people have the right to be treated with respect, and they have the right to their differences, their opinions, the way in which they choose to live and interact. However, when someone is at this level with what we call tolerance, if they had their choice, they would not be interacting with people that were different than they were. So that's purely where tolerance lies. That's really the minimum of what helps an environment on a campus function at all, is for people to be at tolerance. I'm going to go downward first and talk about before tolerance. Often people deal with differences by avoidance. When people have a difference they are uncomfortable with between themselves and another person, often they'll just avoid them. They'll try not to interact with them or find ways not to be in a project or in the same location as that person. They simply just try to stay away. Even prior to that, someone who is not good at handling differences may be at a level that we call repulsion. That's where they not only don't want to be around that person, they believe that that person doesn't have a right or that they should not be a part of an environment. I doubt that you have much of that on your campus, but obviously we know that exists in society. I have to tell you that I think about this scale, and I had thought about it during our recent elections, and I know that as I read the Chronicle of Higher Ed every day, I see more and more where these components come to light in different ways. Again, having this language to talk about it is important. I want to now go to the other end of the scale, above tolerance. So instead of just respecting someone having a difference that you're not comfortable with, the next level is acceptance. That's where you know that there are differences and that you may have an attitude of, well, why can't we all just get along? People are people. I am going to ignore the differences, and I know they're there, but I'm just not going to let them become an issue. That's where we accept people's differences, but we're not really taking the greatest advantage or creating an environment where those differences can make a difference. That would happen when someone is at the appreciation stage within this continuum. It's when you not only recognize the differences, but you see them as positives. You look for what is it about that difference that you can either learn from or that you can leverage or that is a complement to the other differences around you or the other available perspectives and traits and characteristics for individuals with whom you interact. In an appreciation state, you not only value those, but you seek them out and you enjoy and you choose to be around people that are different than you. I share this skill with you to say it is a journey. It is also something that is particular to any given difference that you may have with someone, because there may be some differences that you have great appreciation for. There could be some that fall into the repulsion category for you. That's where having a language to talk about someone's behavior, not only in the workplace, but in the classroom or among the faculty and administration, just in general on your campuses, is important. As you think about a marketing perspective with this scale, it's thinking about how do we look at what is happening around us as well as what is happening on our campuses, and we focus on how can we move those messages to the appreciation level, valuing differences, calling them out, leveraging them, and thinking about where differences can make a difference. As we think about this tolerance scale, I hope that you'll find this to be a tool that you can use in describing and discussing behaviors, being able to think about how do you really leverage all the differences that exist on your campus, within your staff, within your teams, and within those populations with whom you're communicating. A second tool I want to share with you is a construct we call cultural dexterity. If you're going to value, how do you do that? What is the skill? What are the things that you do, the competencies that you pull together? As we talk about someone's cultural dexterity, it is a professional skill. It's something that you use in your workplace that allows you to collaborate more effectively and to communicate among multiple different types of folks within the culture in which you're working. Looking at all those differences and variables and thinking, how can I make them make a difference? I want to share with you what makes up cultural dexterity. There are three components to this. It is your cultural intelligence, or your CIQ. It is your emotional intelligence, your EIQ, and then it's also your business intelligence, your BIQ. I know we're often using many models, but you'll notice at the intersection of these three ways of existing in these three sets of skills is what you see in the gray portion in the middle, which is your cultural dexterity. Let me give you a bit more information about each of these three. As we think about cultural intelligence, it is our awareness of our own culture as well as other cultures. What are the dynamics? What are the differences? How do we explore those? How do we look for them? And then how do we identify the gaps between the different cultures and understand the similarities and the differences? As we think about the emotional intelligence, one that you're probably more familiar with, it's how we function in relationship to others. How do we value those differences? How are we then able to look and understand others and then adapt the way that we exist to the way that others do and bridge that gap between the two? You'll probably be familiar with some of the components of emotional intelligence. It's thinking about, it's listening, it's thinking about how you interact, it's self-monitoring. It's those things that help you understand how to value what's different. The third component, when you think about the business intelligence, it's how you apply this knowledge with all the different people with whom you interact. And it's your skill to then successfully be able to work in different roles, let them work in their role, and then together collectively achieve results. Putting those three together, the CQ, the EQ, and the BQ, helps craft how do you as an individual, or how can you help others work with a cultural dexterity, not just being at the tolerance level on the scale we just saw, but moving into acceptance and then on upward into appreciation for the differences that can help the institution be a fuller experience for everyone involved. All this seems pretty simple, right? That it's these three categories, this is what you do, and you have an inclusive environment. We all know that sometimes simple is not easy. Making sure that we figure out what is it we're doing on campus, how are we allowing bias and unconscious bias to come to the forefront, is really a challenge from day to day. I want to share with you some tips, first of all, individually, of how we can think about bringing our unconscious bias to the surface and managing that. And then I'll share with you some tips about, as a leader, how do you create that inclusive environment? First of all, you see here that self-awareness is really critical. Know where is it that you're prone to these things. We know about our own experiences, where we came from, and being conscious of what that looks like, being able to articulate it, and then knowing where differences are going to occur when you meet someone that has not had common experiences. It's secondly, taking a look at external awareness. It is getting to know other people, not just the assumption by what you may see physically, or you may see one behavior or action or hear one statement. It's really getting to know individuals and having multiple bits of information about them so that you're not seeing them in a single light. It's also having a feedback loop. How do I understand where someone else is? And it's also having them feel comfortable to tell me when I've done something that is biased towards them or that they're uncomfortable with, and the way I've handled the differences between the two of us. Third, self-management, you may recognize as a component of EQ, is to not only become aware, we talked about self-awareness, but to manage those emotional behavioral reactions that you have to others. Thinking about consciously, what are those triggers? It could be, as we saw earlier, emotion or capacity, but it could be a particular viewpoint. You know, campuses are well known for having divergent views between conservatives and liberals. Even a good example is in engineering schools. I've worked with several technical departments where there's jokingly, but sometimes not so jokingly, a bias between an electrical and a civil or an industrial engineer. Those things occur. So thinking about where is it that I have these biases and watching out for them. It could be a trigger about a personality. There are certain types of people that you behave differently to. So that self-management of knowing what may cause you to behave and react in a certain way, and then being prepared with a strategy to take yourself from that reaction, which again, as we talked about, is level 2 thinking, to a more intentional response, which is level 1 thinking, as we encounter those triggers or those situations. The last suggestion and tip I have for you is to think about process management. What are those processes that you can implement that help remove bias or bring to the surface the ways in which we may inappropriately react to differences? That could be in the way that you do focus groups in marketing. It could be by the way you have different people look at any ad or copy for a website or for a promotion. It's making sure that the processes help you bring to the surface those things that may be hindering inclusion or a climate of inclusion where people feel comfortable with those differences that they bring to the table. I'd like to also share with you some tips as a leader. Here are some of the things that you can do. I know that you'll be getting this deck afterwards, so I'm not going to read every one of these to you. I want to give you a moment to take a look at them, but you'll be able to walk away with that. Just a couple to highlight, to think about as you're making decisions, what are all those different inputs that should be happening, and where should they be coming from prior to making the decision? Who would be someone that is not typical to consult about a particular type of interaction? Good example, in an academic, setting up an academic degree program, of course you're going to talk with faculty, but the provost may not think to talk to the marketers, because while it may be the passion of a particular faculty member or their area of expertise and their world's known, world renowned for that, marketers or the admission staff may know that there really isn't interest in that particular area at the level that merits investment in a new major. So taking as a leader a way in which you're going to bring in the unusual and the unexpected as decisions are made. Think about, as a leader, the marriage between your actions and your words, and living out diversity and inclusion can be challenging. Of course, campuses all typically espouse that they're an inclusive environment, that it's a place for people to learn and grow and test, but making sure that there is a check, a feedback loop, a way in which, as a leader, your actions are aligned with that mission, with that statement of who you are, even in the smallest things that happen and that you're involved in. I've covered quite a bit of ground here, and my hope is that as you think about unconscious bias, that second level thinking that happens, that causes the environment on campus or the way that you engage people through your marketing to bring them onto campus, if there are ways that unconscious bias is hindering the fullness of what the institution has to offer, or the fullness of what an individual has to offer as they become a part of it, that these tools, these concepts, these ideas about the interaction of the different variables in the model, to think about your reactions to differences and those around you on the tolerance scale, to look at cultural dexterity and continuing to build those skills and encourage those skills in others, so that as the environments are full of a variety of different perspectives and people and experiences at the table, that those differences will be leveraged and that they'll make a difference in the experience that not only you but others have as being a part of your campus. With that, Megan, I'll pass it back to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that may come up and any thoughts or feedback that people may have.
Thank you so much, Julie. We do have a couple of questions here, so I'll just kind of walk through those with you. I loved, the idea of applying this to marketing, and you spoke to that a bit throughout the presentation. We had a question about applying these lessons to recruitment and how specifically folks in the admissions office can take lessons like this and apply it to interactions with students. Do you have any advice on that?
Sure. Again, as I've worked with institutions and we've had enrollment officers and teams involved, one of the things that has come to light from their experience is to not only think about how we're recruiting students, everything from what does the atmosphere look like when a student walks on campus. Are we providing something that's comfortable? Are we helping them understand the process? I think that's a big piece that has come to light in admissions is, with the advent of a variety of types of students coming to campus. They may be a first-generation student. They may not even know, where they're supposed to go, what they're supposed to do. How do you make that comfortable? One of the key pieces that's come to light with admissions and enrollment management is learning not to make assumptions. It's thinking about the different folks that you'll be engaging with. What is it that you can do to make them more comfortable? And I see more and more that they're doing focus groups and talking with not only guidance counselors, but talking with individuals, parents, students. And of course, as we have populations that are single parents that are working, going back to get their education, they may be older. What are the dynamics that matter to them? And that helps the admissions office know not only how to message the information and provide it in a way that's easy for different stakeholder groups or different interested parties to gain the information, different technologies, all of those things, but also how do you help them feel comfortable in the process of making a decision? Those are ways that different departments, as we've walked through these ideas of leveraging and working with the differences, have begun to bring to the surface and just be comfortable in their processes, that they're not making assumptions and treating people more similar than they should along the way, and where the differences mean that they, as an admissions office, should be providing another kind of information or another kind of interaction.
Yeah. And Julie, do you have any, I know you shared a couple of tools toward the end. We had questions about specific exercises or formats for having those discussions. Do you have any recommendations there?
There are quite a number of ways to do that. I've engaged with campuses where often the senior leaders will take on the task of having a workshop, a half day, a whole day workshop, where I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, there were 4 categories. And after looking together about these common definitions and using some models like the We Connect model, they sit down and they almost do an audit of figuring out what is it, if we step back and remove ourselves, what is happening. Often that'll occur either by diverse teams looking at those different parts of campus, or it can be admissions looking at academic looking at staff, so that there are different sets of eyes that are coming to review where is this happening on campus. Often, too, using those same definitions that the leaders are working with, student organizations will have those same discussions. Looking at something like the We Connect model, what is it? How do we identify ourselves? Having those, using that format to introduce themselves to one another, things that you can't see or someone may not know. Learning how to ask those questions to better know someone. Those are some of the ways that on a campus, different folks have become more aware of the information. And I'll be very honest to tell you that where the campuses seem to be most successful in valuing differences, it begins with leaders. It could be student leaders, it could be campus leaders. It needs to be championed. And one of those tips that I just brought to your attention around making sure that your behaviors are in congruence with your words is so critical.
Absolutely. And I think one thing I was just thinking about, in following the presentation, Julie, specifically, is as, schools are looking to recruit more international students, bringing in different perspectives and different cultures, it's so important for us to have conversations like these around how we apply these lessons to marketing, to admissions, and to everything that we do on campus.
Megan, you're absolutely right. And I'll give you a real quick example about international. One of the head of international student activities at American University was sharing with me at one point that one of the things that people didn't realize is that many of the countries in which they recruit students, that rice is a staple, that's a key part of the cuisine that they're typically eating. When I guess there are several different cafeterias on campus there, but a couple of the different cafeterias on campus didn't offer rice except in certain menus. And one of the things that, again, no intention there, but when they sat down and talked about what is it that students come to student services, where she was leading, and say, I'm not familiar with this cuisine. I don't eat in this particular cafeteria on campus because they don't have the things that I'm looking for. It became very simple to say, because of the population on our campus, we need to have rice at every meal. It made all the difference in the international students, where that was a part of their home culture, feeling comfortable to walk in, try some new things, but having that comfort, and very simply around rice. So that's just a quick example of how, when we really look at what cultures do and ask good questions, make no assumptions, it's easy to make people feel comfortable and welcome with very simple pieces of understanding another person.
Julie, I can't think of a better statement to wrap up the presentation. I think we've covered everyone's questions. I just want to remind everyone who attended today, if you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to us. We will be sending that recording out later this week. You can reply to that email, and we'll make sure either our team or Julie are looped in so that we can follow up with you guys. I just want to thank you again, Julie, so much for your time today. It's always fantastic to take a step back from the daily functions of marketing and our jobs on campus and think about how we can better communicate with the people who interact with our brand. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to be with you all.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.